Support for today's program comes from Calculogic, makers of triggerware software, real-time analytics, and machine learning. You can learn about Calculogic from visiting the Open Mic Friday area of our website, www.c4SCS.org. I'm Bob Celeste, and welcome to Open Mic Friday. For those of you who are on the live call, if you'd like to talk to our guest today or ask a question, please raise your digital hand or type in a question for us. Susan Ramonat is Chief Executive at Spiritus Partners, and she joins us to discuss cybersecurity risk and how blockchain technology might be used to enhance medical device safety and quality. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Bob, and welcome during the holiday season. I'm talking from festive Edinburgh, Scotland.
Ah, great. Is it what kind of weather do we have over there?
High 40s, rain comes and goes, and bright Christmas lights.
Nice. That's Fahrenheit, right? Not centigrade?
Yes. I still haven't adjusted to that.
Well, could you first, just to kind of start us off, just give us an idea around your role at Spiritus and a little bit what Spiritus does?
Sure, and I'm delighted to and welcome questions from the audience. My co-founder, Bob Clinton, and I founded Spiritus in early 2016. We focus on medical device safety and quality, ensuring that devices are safe and secure through their operating lives. We've been on a journey really for several years in trying to explore some of the challenges for the various parties that are concerned, certainly health systems, device manufacturers, but ultimately patients and their clinicians. As we started to look at this set of problems, we realized there were a combination of established and emerging technologies and an opportunity to deliver solution to the various players that we thought could take us to a much higher standard. So I can get into some of that detail, but I think from the company history standpoint, it's interesting to note the background of myself and my co-founder. I come from about 30 years in Wall Street and banking, everything from institutional sales, product management, operational risk, technology strategy, and then finished the last 6 or 7 years of my career with a regulated firm that provides services to banks and wealth managers as the head of risk. So I was facing off with regulators and examiners, working with our legal and audit teams to ensure that we had policies, procedures, and controls in place appropriate to the industry sector we were operating in, but central to that, particularly a business that relies on technology, complex operations, stringent procedures and controls, and a variety of regulatory entities. I developed a real strong appreciation as I built the risk management program for just how complex it is to manage across complex organizations and then deal with outside parties, be they clients or your vendors and suppliers. My co-founder, Bob, comes from several decades working in data. Back in the late 80s, we referred to this as business intelligence. He worked for some of the big consulting firms, IBM, CSC, KPMG, EY, typically providing data solutions into Fortune 50 companies and or government agencies. Over the arc of his career, he saw many different technologies being brought to bear, common sense of challenges. And when the two of us started looking at the challenges around medical device safety, recognizing that these were problems that were common not only across health systems and manufacturers, but really global challenges as we did our research. We recognized there might be an opportunity to bring some of these technologies to bear in a way that they hadn't been before and really tackle some of the problems. So happy to get into that and also to explore why it is that I find myself in Edinburgh, Scotland at the same time as we're certainly addressing the market here, very active in North America as well. I just got back from a trip to Canada and we'll be back in the States as I am frequently during the winter.
Great. So, as we've seen medical devices kind of evolve over the years. And interesting that you brought up your partner's experience in data. The combination now, if we look at a medical device as being maybe a physical object, and then the data side of it or the digital side of it, how do you work with that with even at the policy level when you're working with regulators in the industry?
Well, there's certainly a framework that the FDA has in place. They're going to reference appropriately standards that exist, whether it's coming out of the NIST framework, ISO standards, the ISO 27001 standard, but certainly the FDA and other regulators are actively engaged in trying to understand from a real world evidence standpoint, are these devices delivering, if you will, and how is the data being used, and from a diagnostic or therapeutic standpoint. But they have that other eye to cybersecurity and the frameworks, whether it's quality management systems, information security, sound practice more generally. It's a moving target for them. As you may be aware, they've recently reissued some guidance. They've got a comment period around that. It's interesting to note really how challenging this is. One of the chief information security officer at a prominent hospital system in the United States shared last summer, a year ago, that in his facility he has some 25,000 connected devices. That's probably a census of 15 to 20% of all the devices and equipment in the facility, acute care setting, and perhaps some outpatient. Of those 25,000 connected devices, 6,000 unique makes, models, and versions. Underneath those, maybe a dozen or so operating systems. So from his point of view, each device is a snowflake, if you will. When he thinks about just routine patches and upgrades, the cadence and pace with which that needs to be done, and then when you get down to the firmware level challenges you might have with manufacturers, at least from his standpoint, contractually being in a position where they're the ones they or a third party that they've certified are the only ones that can conduct the upgrade, if you will. Extend that out of the hospital to vulnerabilities or upgrades for implants, and you have different set of challenges. Do I know and understand? Is there some registry, if you will, that the prescribing physician or the attending physician has that has followed that patient over a period of time? Vulnerabilities aren't limited to software and algorithms. They may be vulnerabilities that are attributable to the connectivity and the communications methods, the signal processing side of things. So you start to pull at this problem in a number of different directions, and certainly it's an entry point for us, and was an entry point for us, that connectivity, software enablement, interoperability, devices with other devices, with EHRs, with pharmacy systems, and similarly algorithms tying devices to one another. There, a good example would be a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump talking to one another, if you will, potentially tethered with a smartphone where a parent is relying on an app and an alert system to notify them that there's an issue with their child in the other room. So as we push the frontier, this is a broader theme that we've recognized, is that innovation has a double-edged sword to it. So innovation, yes, in information technology, innovation in the materials that are being used, innovation in design and production. You can think now of 3D printing and 4D printing. From a health system standpoint, the introduction of innovation by manufacturers, which is cutting edge and certainly delivering meaningful benefits from a diagnostic and therapeutic standpoint, further complicates their environment. So the volume and complexity of devices and medical equipment, the move from the acute setting into outpatient facility, community facility, self-management, preventive management, in-home, this arc of the innovation has with it corresponding challenges that it presents in terms of ensuring that a device safe and in good order at the point of care. And it's that we've proposed to tackle and are addressing.
Interesting. So such a multifaceted environment, even before we even get into nefarious activity possibly or protecting the devices themselves. You have a tremendous amount of coordination on the part of hospital staff even to manage all these devices. And as you were talking about the different operating systems across different vendors, and especially as you were saying about the when we have devices that are starting to be able to cooperate with each other and interface with each other.
Yeah, certainly that's the case. And if we take the information technology side out of it, from a service standpoint, devices and equipment, oftentimes the hospital staff, whether it's clinical engineering, clinical asset managers, if you will, medical physics staff, as they're referred to here, med tech or staff, oftentimes there's a third-party service provider that's been certified by the manufacturer, represents the manufacturer, or a distributor. They're involved in actually conducting the repair and attesting at some level that they've done the repair in keeping with the work order and guidance. Similarly, you have certainly on the diagnostic side, you have an opportunity where you may have third-party labs involved. If there's actually clinical research being done associated with the device, you may have contract research organizations and the like. On the side of, let's be clear about what we're talking about. This could be a bed, hoist, or mattress. It could be an infusion pump, an implantable defibrillator, certainly an orthopedic implant. But significantly, from a healthcare operations standpoint, and important in terms of where things happen in an acute care setting, whether from the standpoint of revenue cycle management or importantly from a patient clinical outcomes and patient safety standpoint, the operating theater is significant, as are the diagnostic theaters. So now I'm thinking about surgical instruments and flexible endoscopes in particular, which go through some form of reprocessing, decontamination, and sterilization services. Here again, now we introduce additional players. In the UK, there are a number of major players, as in the US, who are providing outsourced sterile services. Right? So they'll take surgical trays and the instruments, dental instruments, if you will, endoscopes, which often are treated and handled within a hospital, but nonetheless, you could have what we would refer to as a lift out, where an outsourced provider is actually providing those sterile services with the organizational structure, the controls, the training, and so on to do that. We're introducing additional parties. I mentioned as well, that framework of policy, procedures, and controls. You have entities that are coming in, performing, yes, internal audit, but inspection and testing and certification work as well. Still additional parties. And then these assets, particularly the ones that I mentioned, that are pertinent in an acute care setting, often then are sold through auction and or disposed. So there's a life cycle, if you will, after that. We certainly know that a lot of ventilators, infusion pumps, endoscopy equipment, and the like ends up in developing countries by way of market. So this idea of having a service record, one service record for life, yet understanding that actually it's a complex ecosystem of players that may have touched that in hospital, in an ambulatory setting, in office, in a mobile setting, or in home. This life cycle, if you will, the service life and operating life, is one that has not been well connected. It's been very siloed and remains siloed.
So is this where you see the interest in blockchain as a sort of the immutable neutral area, being as these devices may change hands many times? You may, if you're trying to transfer records and updates that have occurred to these devices, in a typical manner, you may lose some of them. And maybe blockchain is the way of making sure that entire record is available to the new owner or the future owners.
So certainly, to the extent there's actual change in title and ownership, that it's not just a supply chain use case. So this is the insight that we arrived at is, Yes, supply chain makes sense in that sort of peer-to-peer, exchange of transaction that is a financial and a legal transaction. But your insight's a good one. If we look at a shared registry that is permissioned and designed so that information which is necessary to share between parties is shared selectively and appropriately, but around the asset you have that single service record, it is possible, we believe, in a concerted fashion to define and design from a business, commercial, clinical standpoint and an operational standpoint, and then get at something technically that also addresses the legal and proprietary concerns that the parties would have. And that's really the journey that we've undertaken here. So very insightful question. It is, in a sense, if you think of it, the variety of actors who have touched this asset over its operating life and will, as it moves on, and artifacts associated with the service work that's been performed in some fashion, and the attestations associated with that. That really is what we've tried to bring together. Now, there are siloed systems today, equipment management systems, ERP systems, field service software, certainly GRC systems, clinical workflow. The way that we've built the platform and from a design principle standpoint is this is not a blockchain. We're not building a blockchain. We've created an application and analytics capabilities that are API enabled, and we are blockchain protocol agnostic. So we're able to hash that record, if you will, that rich record of actor, asset, artifacts around the activities that have been performed in the attestations. But we also have APIs that enable us to potentially be embedded, have Spiritus inside, if you will, an equipment asset management system, field service software, quality management system, or incident management system, and then be able to present that back. But they do maintain that record. And certainly here, one of the reasons we are here in Scotland is that we are dealing with a single payer, single provider. That simplifies things at some level. It's still nonetheless a very complex environment, but that gives you that perspective and that interest in seeing things through, if you will, from end to end, and a coherence that perhaps is more challenging when we come back to North America and back to the United States. That said, we really have worked hard to address what we consider to be common challenges and issues while being sensitive to those things that will be specific to a jurisdiction.
Interesting. So one of the things that you just mentioned, which just to back up a bit on a technical side, obviously, blockchain is sort of, you're going through the hype curve and all of that. And when people say we have a blockchain application, you have this kind of imagination that everything is going into the blockchain. And what you just talked about before was interesting about the level of interface you have via APIs versus what you're doing on the blockchain, which is hashing that data. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why you do that and put that in a mutable record.
Sure. I like to use the term, the rule of parsimony here. Only that which needs to be on chain, if you will, to support that service record, and have if we understand the registry to be an append-only database, so it is the sequence of events, right? And then the content that actually is represented on chain is de minimis at that level. And then there's an off-chain operational data store. There certainly is the off-chain legacy data sources that the various parties would have. But if you put the analytics over the top, then we like to say, rather than immutable, that it is hard to change and tamper evident. So if we're able to rely on that record with levels of assurance we haven't before in terms of being able to trace chain of custody and the who did what, when, and where, to what standard, against what work order, against what requirement, then we have a much higher level of assurance. Now, to the extent we can get that as close to near real time, now we're really starting to be able to get at that aspirational, at the point of care. Do I know and understand, as a clinician or as a patient, that this device or this piece of equipment is safe and in good order?
Okay. One of the things in supply chain, in our studies that we've been doing, is we often hear about Bitcoin and we're transferring value, and then the blockchain accounts for that. Is the issue between what is the digital world, or the digital world and the record of it, and then the real world where things actually take place, and the fact that they can get out of sync by mistake, because people make errors, things happen. I have recorded that I've moved this, but when I go and inspect it again, I realize I moved a different one. Are those the kind of things that your system would grapple with?
Certainly, we would see exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you try to compare a record back, it could be malicious, it could be out of ignorance, it could be fat finger. You would recognize that error. So in a flip back to financial services sense, it would keep you from selling more shares than you own, right? Or issuing a disbursement of funds when the funds aren't there. This is one of the reasons Wall Street's been compelled, is that they can take that cycle of a transaction has occurred, now I'm going to clear and settle it. I've compared the records. There is agreement on both parties' side, and now we'll actually settle the transaction. We'll execute the transaction. It's that same thing conceptually. You're ironing out the friction between organizations. You're reconciling the data with a much higher level of assurance, and that allows parties to proceed. Benignly, cash and securities and finance, much more impactful patient safety, clinical outcomes, and the like. So the other side of it is, and we're coming at this from, what might go wrong. Certainly, notices and recalls, field safety alerts being actioned much more quickly. We would hope over time, as we start to add analytics, that there would be an opportunity from a real world standpoint to not only provide evidence, but to the extent that there's information about incidents, that manufacturers are in a position to see that pattern of events, if you will, complaints and incidents more rapidly, recognize whether or not it could be attributable to their device, to design, to production, materials, whatever it would be, training, and the like, and then have that cycle feed then back out into the field. Unfortunately, this is slow today. It can take weeks, months, or otherwise to recognize there's something, and then a long period of time. And then not necessarily assurance, because downstream the manufacturer can be quite far removed from the life of that asset and where it's been. So we want to cut those cycles of recognition and recall significantly. We think over time that takes preventable injuries, complications, and deaths, and reduces the numbers at a time when all of that innovation's happening at the same time, and then the sheer volumes are growing. We are introducing much more advanced care into developing countries at a rapid rate, potentially not as quickly as they need to, and these extended supply chains also translate into an extended clinical profile, if you will, that needs to be addressed.
Interesting. I'm going to try a little bit of technology here myself.
Okay.
We have Daniel Fritz is on the line. I'll see if I can unmute him, and he's got a question for you.
Okay.
Hey, Daniel. Daniel,
can you hear me, Bob?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm just impressed by the complexity of the topic and the subject. It's really amazing, the potential and the implications. It's crazy. And I just want to kind of know what is the strategy, or what are the next steps in terms of addressing this going forward, given that it is such a complex topic that involves so many partners and stakeholders.
That's a wonderful question, Daniel, and I appreciate your thought about complexity. There's one way to think about this separate from this use case, and I think it's fundamental to any area where you're contemplating use of blockchain, and that is to say, you have a point of view about that end state, but you want a minimum viable ecosystem or minimum viable consortium of players that represent the cross-section of players that you need to have involved. Specific to this as well, though, would be what devices would you want to focus on, and what operating life, if you will, is meaningful? So there are a number of different directions we might go in and are able to go based on the way we've defined the platform and the work we've done over the last 2 years, talking with manufacturers, talking with health systems, actually exploring all this. Foundational to this is actually having device identifiers. So you may well be familiar with the concept of unique device identifiers, the FDA most advanced in this, but the EU MDR providing for unique device identifiers. In tandem with that, standards, GS1 certainly has done an extraordinary job in the healthcare field. There's a program here in the UK known as Scan for Safety in England that has a number of major boards. It's been undertaken for a period of years. And the idea is to take what the benefits you get from scanning technologies, tagging technologies, RFID, real-time location services through the life cycle at the point of care, and then adding to that, standards framework like the GS1 standard. So at the foundational level, those are crucial to how we've defined and designed the platform. But we can take identifiers of all sorts. But those identifiers go beyond the device itself to more product attributes, likewise location and other elements to this. So I'll broaden that standard. So I've come at your question 2 ways. I've said, on the one hand, it's about the players we involve and that cross-section of interested parties that allow you to test out your use case. They're the foundational pieces around the identifiers, if you will. Now I'll add the central question, which is, where does the rubber meet the road, where we really start to have impact in terms of patient safety and clinical outcomes, delivering real-world evidence, or enabling manufacturers to perform their post-market surveillance and adverse event management responsibilities. And that is, what device classes might I choose? What area of the hospital do I want to focus on? Those things that run through an operating theater. Do I want to focus on implants, because we know we have significant issues globally around implants, orthopedic mesh implants, cardiac implants, and the like? Is that an area to focus? We have a number of use cases and opportunities that would allow us to explore each of these areas. Bob and I have talked a bit about as well, as relates to operating theater and diagnostic procedures in the advances, surgical instruments, flexible endoscopes. And in this case, your use case is more around ensuring that those devices and instruments are decontaminated and sterilized, that the cleaning, disinfection, and if necessary, sterilization procedures are followed, so that when they're brought back in to use with another patient, whether in hospital, where they've been handled at an endoscopy unit, or where they've gone to an off-site reprocessing unit and brought back, in the case of surgical trays, that you've tackled that. I could as well take a clinical pathway around an acute care disease process and extend that out, and now have insight into the downstream clinical outcomes, which may actually involve infection. So now we start thinking about, can I associate an infection potentially with a procedure or device? Are there other patients or staff that may have been affected? It is complex, but there is a core here of capabilities. And if you design and define things properly with the right parties, you can take it in a number of different directions.
Right parties.
So I'm just, Daniel, how'd that work for you?
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Bob. That's great. I mean, really, I understand. I mean, we're in the same situation. It's really around prioritizing use cases and finding where the value is. So, and that's going to be I think the art of this is how to find that use case which is going to start it all. So, thanks.
So Susan, I just want to bring back to one of the areas that we talked about, and that you had talked about earlier, which was cybersecurity. So now, we've looked at managing these products through their life cycle and between ownership, but from a hospital standpoint, what are the kind of concerns here around cybersecurity with these thousands of connected devices?
I'll make a distinction between the data breach and the privacy breach, where personally identifiable information, obviously patient and health data, is compromised, and the many nefarious effects that might be taken to around a device. Devices could as well become the conduit for attackers to move laterally to the IT systems of the hospital, as well as the health system for that matter. And now you could have a broader attack that actually gained its footing by way of device or piece of equipment. That's certainly something that some of the white hat researchers have identified as a challenge. Another way to look at it, and this is true around critical infrastructure industries as well, is the distinction between the world of IT and the operational technology. So I'll call the devices and equipment operational technology. And that is that you could have attacks that are intended to actually cripple the resilience and the operation of the device, either compromising the data integrity. So what's being read off the device is in fact not accurate. That could be manipulated expressly or otherwise, or simply take control of the device and issue a command shock would be an example. A worst case scenario would be an attack that is staged where hospital staff are potentially rallying in an ICU or a critical care setting to a number of patients who appear to have coding issues that multiple things are going wrong, not recognizing that in fact there may have been an attack, and that what they're reading off of the systems of the monitors and otherwise is not accurate data, and potentially delivering the wrong therapy, the wrong intervention at the precisely the wrong time. This is certainly something we've heard from hospitals and clinicians as well. It's a horrifying scenario to consider.
I have Lorena on, let me just see. Lorena?
Yes.
Hi, did you have a question?
No. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
No, not specific question. Thank you. I just wrote it down. I just wanted to. Sorry, I just wanted to see. I'm just catching in, and I'm like willing to have the information that I missed. So I was just wondering.
Sure. Yeah, we'll post that. Okay. So getting back to some of the devices and some of the work around. So I'm going to just go throw a bunch of terms out, and I think that you've touched on a lot of this. So we already touched on blockchain, things such as IoT, machine learning, analytics, all playing a part in this kind of arena. And I'm wondering not only from an operation standpoint, but getting back to when we're talking about the regulators and policy level, how these kind of things that are fast growing, very complex, are being dealt with.
That's a wonderful question, and I think regulators across industry sectors are asking themselves. It certainly was the spirit of what I've heard more broadly. I'll connect distributed ledger and blockchain to those other technologies in the sense that to the extent you have sensors, IoT, a sensor and actuator, playing off one another in any setting, certainly within the broader blockchain enterprise vision that exists, there is a view of being able to accommodate billions of devices down the road, throwing off data. And so the question becomes, can I mediate the devices, the interaction of a device and an app, or two devices, a sensor and actuator, if you will, by virtue of blockchain, where I'm validating the identity of the device, and then, if you will, moderating the movement of the data back and forth. That's interesting in and of itself, but I think you're asking a deeper question around machine learning, AI, and the like, which is that from a regulatory standpoint, be confronted with the introduction of these technologies and actually the convergence of them, the confluence of them at the same time. Certainly our platform really could be looked at it that way. IoT enabled devices, if you will, with sensors, relying on RFID tagging or real-time location systems, then distributed ledger technology with the network implications of that, and then on top of that, some machine learning algorithms, if you will, that inform the analytics that might be done, that allow you to benchmark and ascertain where you are, or develop insights that are carried in a health economic sense back into the clinical setting to understand not only what's working, but cost-effective delivery of care as well in a value-based setting. All of those things, peel it away. How do I know and understand how these elements play together? You can't just look at one of these technologies. They are converging and coming together in a way that it's got a rich set of questions. I don't think there's one answer to that question, but certainly it's an important one to be asked.
So if we look at the healthcare provider or the caregiver, possibly going through years and years of training to cure disease or treat disease, and finding themselves in this kind of IT environment that they thought they were walking into a hospital, but they were walking into a connected universe, if you will. Are there programs now that are starting to kind of reach out and educate them on what tomorrow is going to look like for them?
I think AI gets a lot of the attention as regards this. If I generalize the case, I think what all need to do is work from the clinician and the patient bedside, if you will, back into the operation and back into the analysis and analytics, and continuously ask a question. In your Daniel certainly suggested this as well. What are those use cases that are really going to deliver value? And flip side of that is the disruption worth it, separate from the costs? So any sound use case, I think, is going to start with that. So if I roll forward to your question and look at where enabling technologies are going, it's possible, at least from a standpoint of medical device equipment and repair, to envision a world that's AR and VR enabled. We haven't talked about that, but hands-free maintenance, or hands-free work, with that visual cue, if you will, to be able to actually look at and service a piece of equipment and then record that evidence, if you will. That is an example of something that could be hashed to a registry, recorded as a part of that service record. But from the standpoint of the clinician or the med tech engineer or the clinical engineer, medical physics staff, they're actually able to do their work in a way that's far more efficient and comprehensive. And we're able to preserve those records in a way we wouldn't have before. Can also envision voice activated, a simple tap on a wristwatch, if you will, that activates something. So it's not intrusive clinically, and it's efficient in what it's done. Certainly, again, I'll mention again the Scan for Safety program here in the UK, where they have worked hard, at the point of care to minimize the disruption. So that Scan for Safety really has an implication and a payoff that the clinical staff see in the patient's experience.
And anybody that's visited a doctor in the past year or so, or at least, you see that the interaction with computers is almost more than the interaction with the patient sometimes. Can I get the doctor to look me in the eyes once? Do you see this, especially when we're looking at AI, machine learning, being able to provide that back end almost follow up with the doctor so that they can then spend less time with the computer and more time with the patient? Is that sort of a plan?
Well, the electronic patient record and prescribing software I'll not stride into, But if you're able to say that we're going to automate those things that are routine, but we're going to train the machine with expertise, and this is the distinction that's made. Is it expert learning or machine learning informed by expertise, or is it truly off on its own? And do you have the visibility around the models that were used? It's interesting. There's long been in data science work done on data provenance and workflow provenance, and knowing and ensuring that the data sets that were used, that some model is applied to and intermediate outputs arrived at, and then the model refined. And then still further, we can think of this not only in healthcare, we can think of it in terms of autonomous vehicles, we can think about it around grading systems for tests that were taken, say the law, the law school exams or whatever it would be, that at some point you're able to pull apart and look at what were the data sets, what were these intermediate models and conclusions, how was this model trained and applied. This really goes across sectors, and I think in healthcare we're rightly asking very deep questions about this. And to what extent, say in imaging, for example, can we rely on and must we rely on? The flip side of that is that the speed with which things can be done. Work's been done around imaging for stroke victims, people suffering brain injuries, and we're able to cycle those times now down from where it may take the space of 2 days. We can get that down to just a few hours. That's the difference from a clinician standpoint in making that decision whether to perform a surgery or not, or to introduce some medication, which may not be the right one. So there are tremendous advances in imaging technology that are informing very acute situations, accident and emergency situations, at one extreme. And then there's the more mundane experience that we have with a general practitioner. What is it that they're culling through in their records that they're looking for from a previous session that's jogged in their memory, that's there's new research that's come out that's telling them that there may be a contraindication for a medication that I'm about to introduce to this patient with multiple morbidities, and now I have this insight. I'm not searching through the patient record. I'm able to put these two things together. That certainly is part of the promise.
Interesting. I have Kevin Capach on the line, and let me see if I can unmute him here. See if the technology can work. I'm chasing around the Kevin.
UI.
There he is. Kevin, can you hear me? I've got 3 Kevins on here, 3 Kevin Capaches. Maybe I'll just ask his question.
Try the one underneath, Bob. The one underneath that?
Yep, I did.
Okay.
And maybe this is him. I only seem to be able to get one open, this one. But let me read Kevin's. He says, with FDA mandating UDI, the unique device identifier, your technology can be the healthcare blockchain highway. How do you access the silos of EHR?
Boy.
Loaded question.
Yeah, so we've revisited this several times. It's a very astute question. The unique device identifier, if it's in the electronic patient record, is notable, but it's not comprehensive information, and so there's real questions about what data would need to be there to have it be meaningful. And this is this sort of on-chain, off-chain, embedded within the EHR or not. You can also appreciate that in some cases there's additional parts and equipment, and that particular patient pathway, that record itself may not come together with records that are held elsewhere. So the asset, it's interesting and useful to have the UDI in the the patient record. But if we haven't gotten interoperability around patient records, now we still have this disconnected path. So we've tended to focus on the asset itself and following the asset, if you will, and then connecting back to the patient and being pulled into the patient record rather than pushing to it. So our use cases are varied in the sense of to what extent do they want to be on the front foot with the patient and the patient record directly involved. It's a less nettlesome problem outside of the U.S. It's still a complex issue, and clearly the privacy and security concerns that exist, the various data protection regimes must be addressed. There are differences. One's not necessarily harder than the other. There are differences in how you, from a business and technical standpoint, honor those and enable them, and are able to not only instantiate them but demonstrate and evidence that you're following the privacy regime is a challenge.
What kind of let's say real world implementations are you seeing? Hospitals starting to experiment with the technology, or do you see it going beyond proof of concept, or is it still at the stage of experimentation, trying to explore how it might fit in?
I see both. Certainly the awareness level compared to a year ago is extraordinary. If I'd said blockchain in a room at a cocktail party over the holidays, I would have gotten what. Now it's when and how. I often also say that sometimes it's not what people don't know about blockchain, it's what they know that isn't so that can be a problem. So there's still an education element to this. I saw this in finance and I see it in healthcare. Sometimes the best proof of concept is one that actually gets the right people in the room to talk through and understand what it does and doesn't do, and then demonstrate that rather than being aggressive about a really robust use case where you're sure you're going to have high value. Maybe bite off something more manageable where you demonstrate your ability to work together as a good initial use case. More broadly, it's not hard to see how you may want to step back and say, well, if I'm focused on medical devices and equipment, and I've just described not only all the different elements that are involved in an acute care setting, but then the long operating life and the many different settings, maybe I want to step back and say, is this part of a broader set of enabling technologies and solutions that I might put in place? So hence my focus on standards, emphasis on tagging technologies and real-time location, geo-location services, and other things. When you start to bake those things in, you start to see that, in fact, from a health system standpoint, yes, I can get at patient safety and clinical outcomes. I can start to drill into and better understand whether I'm delivering, value from a real-world standpoint. From a manufacturer standpoint, I'm on my front foot from a post-market surveillance and adverse event management standpoint in a way I haven't been before. A distributor is in a better position to understand, how their service teams are performing and meeting and being responsive to their clients. There's a lot of directions where there's value to be ground out. It does, I think, force a real question mark about why point solutions and individual use cases, if you will, around value are being considered. We're certainly seeing that. There's an aha, there's a wake up to, yeah, I can start with this use case, but wow, if I have these other enabling technologies, I'm now supporting all these other things because I'm actually able to track and trace the asset and understand its service record and its condition, if you will, at any point in time. That's very rich.
And you find out that your clients, once they start down this path, they may not have realized what they'll learn until they start to see the data, and then it starts to turn on different lights in their head as far as what they might be able to do and provide some benefit with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had just one of those conversations this morning, and I always enjoy that because it's challenging me as well. We came to this insight around infection control because we were looking at geolocation services, when we recognize that there's some percentage, 5, 10, 15%, whatever it is, of infections that may ultimately be attributable to devices, but it's the intersection of medical devices and equipment and clinical staff and services staff and patients. Now you broaden it out and say, well, if I've got this thread and I'm able to identify the various parties involved, now I can roll time forward and back and maybe have a better understanding as I mount an investigation, what I can rule out, much less rule in, who I can rule out or rule in from a procedure standpoint, control standpoint, and otherwise. So yes, once you start down a path, you start to see many different opportunities here. And again, I'll go back to the point that the asset, the focus on the asset really helps to drive out that insight.
So focusing on the asset and its state, if you will, as
and
well as
yes. The various parties. So this is where I make that supply chain versus operating life distinction. A lot of blockchain use cases, the focus is on this party is in a supply chain, they have vendor relationships, and there's this exchange that occurs, a transaction, and there's a financial trail that's associated with that. That's different from the operating life of an asset. And outside of healthcare, certainly in other sectors where operations and technologies, engineering are very important, the insight has occurred as well that we ought to be able to take the maintenance, repair cycle, corrective actions, inspections and testing, and use blockchain technology paired with other enabling technologies to have a better understanding around the service condition of the asset.
How's the state of the, if you will, being able to visualize all this data in a way that's appropriate to the user?
That's what we've worked hard at. We said a long time ago we were never going to show the machine line or the command line code
right.
that you see at a blockchain presentation. So we've focused very much on the user experience and something that makes sense intuitively, is visually makes sense. So geolocation's part of it, being able to look at reporting and drill down as you would want to, either around an asset, a facility, a unit, whatever it might be. Similarly, as I referenced, we're able to embed our capability through API into field service software, computerized maintenance management systems, other systems as well. So it could be a user experience within existing vendors offering.
Interesting. So one last, because we're heading out the top of our hour, I just want one last question, and this is an odd one. So we know that blockchain grew out of the financial area and cryptocurrencies and things like that. About a month ago, we had a guest on that was looking at fish traceability, and one of the things that they started to investigate after they were able to track the supply chain was that they saw the value of the product go up, and they were going to use some cryptocurrencies to move value back to the supply chain to incentivize better behavior in the supply chain. Do you see any parallel with something like that within a hospital? And again, this is just blue skies thinking. This is not we're going to implement this tomorrow morning, but
I'll put tokens to the side and suggest that from a procurement standpoint, I certainly have heard folks say, if we have a better understanding and can connect, and this is ambitious, connect clinical outcomes, however you measure them for whatever disease process or care pathway somebody's on, and connect that to the performance of a device, for that matter, it could be a pharmaceutical intervention as well. We'll have a different conversation with the manufacturer. From a real-world evidence standpoint, that's an interesting case. Now, when you tokenize, I've certainly heard this thought before about rewarding good behavior. There's a lot of ways to reward good behavior. Transparency of supply chains is certainly things we've heard. Sustainability would be an issue as well. I know I've heard conversations likewise around things as mundane as T-shirts and ensuring that upstream manufacturers are conforming to guidance around sizes or, die lots and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. From my background in finance, I've been very hesitant, knowing I'm going into a regulated sector, what it is, the problems we're trying to address. Put blockchain to the side. Deeply concerned and pragmatic about trying to address problems and meaningfully make a difference. Introducing the complexity of tokens and incentives. We'd like to think that the incentives to come to this middle ground is how I describe it. Come to this middle ground and share information selectively. Provides enough within the context of the existing ecosystem and framework to have people think differently about their business and operating models, their commercial relationships, but from a framework that seems familiar. Introducing tokens and those kinds of incentives, forget about what the secondary market for those is and all the other things that go with that. I think that level of complexity, given the changes in the operating model and business models and the information sharing that we're contemplating, is a step too far right now.
Makes sense. Yeah, definitely. Great. Well, Susan, I really appreciate you being with us today. And it just clicked in my mind where you are and what time it must be on a Friday night.
No worries. It is a Friday night, and this is as I started, a festive city, and it's the holiday season. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, and certainly encourage those who've listened or those who listen to the recording to encourage others. I appreciate the feedback. There's not a day I go by that I don't share some ideas with people and get more back than I shared myself.
That's great. Well, we certainly appreciate your time and wish you a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And everyone, if you join us next Friday, where we'll have as our guest Ron Guido, who's ex-VP of Brand Protection and Supply Chain Integrity for Johnson & Johnson. Ron will share his experience and perspectives in the areas of anti-counterfeit, diversion, and theft. Thank you, everyone, for being on the show today.